It is 8:01, and we know we have some folks who are joining us this time around who may be new. We have quite a large registration list this week compared to prior weeks. So quick introductions here. Myself, I'm Craig Hess. I'm the Director of Corporate and International Training at SAIT. Our team works with organizations to help them upskill and reskill and prepare for the future of work. And very fortunate to be able to host these conversations with Jenny, who I will pass things over to right now.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I am Jenny Gilbert, and one of the hats I wear at SAIT is as a leadership development specialist with Craig's team. So sometimes working right alongside them with our clients, and a lot of times in classrooms with good people like yourselves who are listening today. And I will hand it straight over to our very special guest today, John. Go ahead.
Hi, folks. Good morning. John Partington, he, him. So I'm the Director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at SAIT. The purpose and function of our office is to make SAIT a more inclusive place to work and study. And so I'm happy to be back here for the second time to continue our conversation about inclusive leadership. So thank you, Craig and Jenny, for having me.
We're very thrilled to have you here, John. I know we had our first conversation probably a year or so ago. And back then, I believe you started us off with a tremendous land recognition, and I think we're going to have you do the same thing today. So,
certainly, I'm happy to. So for the folks who might be listening in, we do have a map of Southern Alberta on screen, just showing the rich diversity of languages and cultures of Indigenous peoples here in Treaty 7. And so I thought it was important to really show the different kinds of First Peoples who inhabit originally the land. But with that, we are coming to you from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot and the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Îyârhe Nakoda of Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney, as well as the Métis Nation Region 3. I think it's important to remember that we're all treaty people, and so we should take seriously the importance of thinking deeply about the relationship we share with the land upon which we live, learn, work, and play here in Mohkinstsis, which is now known as the city of Calgary. So with that, that's our acknowledgement.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, so this is a hot topic, if I can use that phrase. Again, I'm really quite overwhelmed by the number of folks that we've had sign up to join us this morning. And I think that this whole concept, John, we got into this about a year ago and talked about inclusive leadership. And I think maybe we could just perhaps pick up there and just get your thoughts on what inclusive leadership means to you. And one of the things that we've touched on is that it's more of a mindset perhaps than a set of actions. And so maybe we could just go from there to start with and see where the trailhead leads us.
Sure. Yes, definitely. Inclusive leadership is a mindset. So it's not, a program that you turn on and off when it's convenient. It's not just a set of checkbox actions that you should do every day. But that mindset piece is really about acknowledging this is a journey of learning and unlearning each day. It's an ongoing process of continually improving the ways in which you interact with and lead others. So the mindset piece is really about trying to foster an environment or the conditions in which everyone feels welcome, respected, and empowered to succeed in the workplace. And so you do that through interpersonal, individual interactions, but also in the systems and the processes and the norms that you set up within your workplace as well. So it's kind of those two pieces that come together to form a mindset.
Very good. Jenny, any thoughts?
I'm busy writing things down. Yeah, lots of thoughts. I really appreciated actually hearing so early on that journey of learning and unlearning. And I think one of the things that's kind of slapped me across the face actually as I've moved through my own journey is the unlearning part and being willing to step right back into, actually, you know what, I don't know. And once we get to there, it doesn't become any easier, but life it's more curiosity. It's easier to have that mindset because we're a little bit more open to the fact that actually there are things that we don't know, and there are things that we've got wrong, and unlearning is perhaps a difficult part, but a really, really important part within there. And then I'm curious, I think we'll bring this out later, but that personal, how did you put it, John? Personal, interpersonal, like there was one-on-one, bigger than that, and then the systems and the processes. And I think that's the bit that's we're starting to see more shift in that
Mhm.
space too.
Certainly. Yeah, there's different layers to it. So in our previous conversation, we kind of started with the foundation of what are some of the capabilities or qualities of behaviors and attitudes that an inclusive leader would do. So there was kind of the 6 C's based on the previous model we looked at. We also talked about, as you say, Jenny, when you make a mistake, not if, but when.
Mhm.
How do you address that? How do you react to it? How do you make it right and move forward? That is all a part of it because, these mistakes are inevitable. I think some leaders become very afraid of saying the wrong thing, making a mistake, and they almost become frozen to act based on that. We've got to push through that feeling because, the learning comes on the other side of that. And so today is what I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit deeper in terms of the underpinnings of those qualities and capabilities, but also the other side of the coin that if someone offends you or someone makes a mistake that you're not happy with,
Yeah.
what kind of course of action might you take? So,
Yeah. And so we have a number of directions we can go. Speaking of making mistakes, I'm going to correct something I did at the beginning, and that is to not remind, or I forgot to remind folks, please do carry on the conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question as we are going through, please pop it in the Q&A section of the chat. If this chat gets going like it normally does, it will fly past. So please do be active there. So, John, we touched on a couple of things. Jenny, I flagged unlearning. I wrote that down right away when John said it because I think that is perhaps one of the toughest things. I think we talked about leaders, perhaps, or individuals as well, just not saying something because they simply are afraid that they're going to make a mistake. And so, maybe, John, let's start there, right? Like, how do we? Jenny and I speak a lot on these Friday morning sessions about just having the conversation
mhm.
or having a conversation. How do we make sure, or how do we enable that conversation around this topic when I think folks are so afraid, not necessarily so afraid, but afraid to make a mistake in this space?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things that need to be established. I mean, one is trust and psychological safety, and I know you all talk about that often. But I mean, a few things to consider if you're on the side of you offending someone else, like we talked last time. I mean, a few things you should do in the moment is center yourself so you don't react defensively. You want to listen to the ways in which you might have mistreated that person. You want to acknowledge the wrongdoing that you've done, but then most crucially, commit to not doing it again next time, either with that person or with someone else. And so you want to make sure that you acknowledge those things in the moment and then move on. So the longer that you linger in those kinds of tense situations, the more awkward it becomes and the more deeply that harm sinks in. And so, let's acknowledge it, do better next time and move forward. So that's a few things to consider if you're on the one side where you make a mistake and someone's not happy with you. Um, I mean, on the other side, let's say someone does something to you that, you think, wait a minute, this doesn't sit well with me. I'm offended in a large or a small way. I mean, you have a few options. I mean, you can always do nothing, right? You can say nothing, you can pretend, it didn't happen or just not acknowledge it. That's one opportunity depending on the situation. I don't know. For me, that usually doesn't go well because I'm a person who stews on these things if I don't say something or acknowledge it. And then they start to build up over time. And then sometimes you have an explosion later on with someone else completely unrelated. And so that's not one I would recommend, again, depending on the dynamics of the situation, which we'll dig into. But if you do want to say or do something, you have at least two choices. So on the one hand, you can call someone into a conversation, or you can call out their behavior in the moment. And so they're similar approaches based on what you're comfortable with and what you want to get out of the situation. When you call someone in, that is a more calm dialogue that usually happens after the fact of the conflict moment. And you're really trying to understand where that person was coming from, their intentions, but then making them understand what the impact is. So, for example, you might say, hey, Craig, when we had that conversation yesterday, you made this comment that didn't sit well. Can you tell me more what you meant? And then after that, if you were to give me an explanation, then I might say, well, you might have meant this one thing, but how it impacted me was very different. And here's why it was hurtful. So next time, please consider this, as we go about our daily work or we work on this project. So that one is a little bit more of trying to establish common understanding, and you're calling that person into a conversation to continue the relationship. So in some instances, you'll want to do call in. On the other hand, it might be more appropriate to call out the behavior. So let's say, Jenny, that comment that you made yesterday, and I would say this to you in the moment in front of other people if they were present, that was really out of line. That doesn't align with our corporation's values, and make sure you don't say it again because it was extremely offensive, and I'm very upset with you. So that's trying to acknowledge it right in the moment. You're going to make very clear to put a stop to that behavior. And if you need to have that public recognition, sometimes very, let's say, distasteful behavior or behavior that's very extreme, sometimes you need to call it out right then and there and nip it in the bud. So that's a different kind of approach with different outcomes. But those are your two kind of options if something goes wrong, let's say.
I think there's so many places to go to. I'd really, really like for us to come back, John. I'm hoping that you'll talk to us a little bit about microaggressions, because I think intent and impact are huge in this conversation, and we often hear this. I didn't mean it, and that's truth. And is understanding the difference between intent and impact. And one of the ways of getting us closer to understanding is sometimes having some understanding on those microaggressions. But the other thing that just sort of sat with me there as you're describing, I'm a huge fan of this call in versus call out, and the value of calling in where it's appropriate. And it holds a relationship intact and removes the potential for blame, shame, and judgment. And one of the sort of lines between the two, and I'd love to be corrected on this if I'm wrong, but calling out if there's harm that's happening. And you mentioned, I forget the words that you used, something along like it was disrespectful or toxic. And we need to deal with that in a moment. And that also speaks to our teams to say, this is not a tolerated behavior. So that's kind of the line of there's that sort of harm, but where possible, calling in helps us to sort of bridge the learning and the unlearning and make that a safe space too. It is about a safe space for learning as well. That's kind of my immediate thoughts on all of that.
Agreed. Go ahead, Craig. Yeah.
No, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that therein lies the line. So, a microaggression, so a small comment or gesture that might be taken the wrong way. Usually, especially if your colleagues who work closely together, I would say that's a call in moment, because, you want to make people understand that their perspective or, these small things that they might say are taken very differently. The trouble if you don't acknowledge microaggressions is it becomes death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah.
So if you hear this kind of comment or series of comments over and over and over again, day by day, that certainly takes its toll on one's physical, mental, and psychological well-being and wellness. And so, that's something that you need to acknowledge. But again, as you say, I mean, if an action or behavior enters the realm of bullying, discrimination, anything sort of at that level of mistreatment, I mean, those things are in violation of policy, legislation, and many other rules that we have in the workplace and beyond. And so usually those things need to be addressed in a different way, especially if you've had a conversation with someone already about their behavior and you're not seeing that commitment to improvement that we might expect. And so calling in does, after a point, depending on how things escalate, calling in no longer serves its function. And so you need to take a different approach.
Yeah, fair. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So really good conversation. And I know we've touched on the call in, call out before in our prior conversation. We also touched on it, Jenny, if you recall, with Deb Herlock a while back as well. John, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit because one of the things that we talked about coming in today, John, was this whole concept of intersectionality. And I think that is a big one, big concept. It'll probably show up again later in the big idea, folks. But I think this is such a large piece to get our heads wrapped around and might be a little controversial for some.
That's right.
Some folks, I think, react to this a little bit differently. But I wonder if we could touch on that because I think this might be a good direction to head right now.
Certainly. Yeah, I'm happy to. And Jenny, please, I know you're keen on this topic, so chime in. Yeah, so this is kind of a large theoretical concept that comes from critical theory. It's kind of the foundation of equity, diversity, and inclusion work overall. And so what this really tries to posit is that we as human beings, we're not just one-dimensional, one thing. And so, you know, the intersection really talks about how our social identities are made up of many different pieces, whether it be our race, gender, class, neurodiversity, our language ability and skills, our socioeconomic status, all of these pieces. And so the interplay and the intersection of those different dimensions is what makes up our lived experience as we go about our lives in the world. And so it's kind of that underpinning of everything that's going on between, you know, interactions in the workplace as you're, you know, living your life, doing the things you like to do, your leisure, your hobbies, and so forth. And so it's really an important foundation to remember that, you know, in the workplace, for example, as we design policies, programs, procedures, we want to make sure we keep this in mind to make sure that everyone has fair access to participate in whatever we're trying to do. And so that's really what this is about. I mean, from an intersectional perspective, depending on the pieces of your identity, you're going to have certain privileges that come with that, and you also might have barriers that you experience as you try and do the things you want to do. And so acknowledging that those barriers exist for one, but then how do we proactively try and remove those is another piece of it. But then also unpacking your privilege as an individual. What does that mean for your life and how you go about what you're trying to do? I know we'll talk about what privilege means because that's a really hot topic as well. So we can unpack that. But that's really what the basis of this work is. I will say that this model and even this image for those folks who are listening, we do have a wheel on screen that's showing different dimensions of identity and how they come together in the middle to intersect and interact. This has kind of been co-opted and misconstrued in some political conversations to say, you know, let's focus on the oppression Olympics. Those who are most oppressed need to be put at the top. It has been used in some ways to say, you know, we need to villainize all white cisgender men. That's not what this is intended for. This is more about trying to think through how do we ensure fair access for everybody, and that's something that we all benefit from. And so how do we really make sure that we, you know, in doing fair practices, we remove hierarchies altogether? And so that's kind of what this is really about. But I'll pause there.
Silence in the room for a second. And it holds, doesn't it? I noticed there's a little note in the chat on privilege, and John, I'm thinking, you know, as I look at this and listen to lots and lots of people in lots and lots of places too, the comment that I hear more often than not is, okay, so I hang out right in the middle of that circle. Like, what now? I mean, you know, I sit here in complete, not me personally, well, we are pretty much me personally, but I sit here in with all this privilege, and everybody's talking about privilege, and I think it's another one that really has gone down an interesting journey in the interpretation. And actually, when you look at this work, there's a very clear-cut way to look at privilege. Would you mind talking just a little bit more about that, so that anybody perhaps on the call who hasn't been involved in this conversation, that's the other thing that we have to remember here. Lots of people have done lots of learning very quickly. Lots of people have been on this journey for a very long time. And we have a lot of folks who haven't even started. And so I think maybe if we just could get some clear-cut definition, and then maybe some more, an example or two from you is, I'm an everyday leader doing my best. What do I do?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if this is the first time you've seen this wheel, it's pretty intimidating, I would say. I mean, one of the first times I saw it, my mind started racing to think, oh my goodness, do I plot where I am at each section? And what do I do? Oh no, I don't want to share my results because I don't know. So I completely understand that. I mean, maybe let's start by saying what privilege isn't, kind of put some guardrails around that to make it clearer. I mean, for one thing, I often hear this when I have conversations on this topic. It's not a denial of the hard work or the sacrifice that an individual has put into their life to get to where they got. We all know we work hard for the things we have, whether that it be, you know, your personal or professional life. And so it's certainly not trying to take away that effort, the time, and the energy that goes into that. Certainly not. It's also not something to feel guilty about or to feel ashamed about based on where you land in terms of how you identify. So that's another piece here. This is not a blame game, shame wheel. So I think those two kind of pegs in the sand are important to establish. I think what it's more about is thinking through, and again, this comes through, lots of reflection time, as you say, Jenny, because this is not something that you sinks in right away. But it's more about thinking about some benefits that you might have that are unearned based on who you are. These things are actually usually invisible to the individual. It's not something that you recognize because, when you walk through a door that's already open, you never considered, was this door closed for someone else? Was it locked? Was it left ajar? And so it's really about unpacking those things and barriers that you don't experience as you go about your life. It's some of the ways that you can save energy by not having to think about or truly consider a certain topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's noted by its absence. And so usually it's those things you're not having to confront in your daily life that make it a little bit easier to navigate. So as an example, I mean, I can use myself, I'll share personally. I mean, if you look at me, you'll see that I'm a white man who's cisgender. I'm also, from a middle class background. I am, able-bodied. All of these things give me a lot of privilege as I walk through the world. But at the same time, I'm a gay person. I am neurodiverse as a dyslexic learner. And so I have experienced the sting of discrimination at a personal and a systemic level. And so as a leader now at SAIT, when I walk into a room, I try and keep those things in mind as I interact with my own teammates, but also with other leaders. Because I walk into a space that, there are other folks who have more power than I do. That room might not have been set up for me originally. I mean, age also plays a factor here. I'm one of the youngest senior leaders at SAIT. And so I usually, when I look around the room, I think, oh my goodness, I don't see anyone else like me here. How do I bridge that gap of making sure we can relate to one another? And how do those things come up in the conversations that we have? So, who takes more airtime than others? Who is interrupted more than others? Who doesn't speak at all? So those are kind of little particular things when I have conversations as a leader that I'm acutely aware of based on my own experience. And so those are a few ways that you kind of put this into action.
Yeah, that's so powerful, John. And I think there's a question here which ties to a question I was going to ask around this. And so Jenny will be used to these long-winded questions. Get ready. How, and that is, you've kind of touched on this, but how can leaders become like more aware of their power and privilege? And I'm going to tie this to the question in the chat is that, what are some concrete steps we could do on a daily or regular basis to combat our biases? I think that means first of all, you need to recognize them. Combat our biases towards it or against particular groups of people. How do we become more mindful of microaggressions and unlearn them? So there's a whole self-awareness piece, I think, that's tied up in here, right? So advice on that. How does a leader become more aware of their power and privilege? How do we check our biases? There's a number of ways I think you could take this, but I think there's a theme there.
It's a lot of work, let me tell you. Yeah, this is not a one-day thing. It's a lifelong process, I think, to do all of those big buckets. But I think one thing, a place to start is to be extra aware how you show up, to the team on a daily basis. Because what I have seen is, my mood sets the tone of the team's mood. So if I show up and I'm upset about something previously, or if I just had a bad interaction with somebody that didn't go very well, and I try to make sure that I keep that within myself and I don't indirectly or not even realize it, apply that frustration to my team based on my experiences, because it's not their fault. They had nothing to do with it. And so, I have to catch myself to say, okay, I'm feeling this kind of way. Where is that coming from? Let me make sure I can share how I'm feeling with the team, certainly, because I want to make sure they know where I'm at, but I don't want to apply that burden to them in turn. So that's one thing. I think also having a 360 kind of listening feedback loop is important because for many of these power and privilege pieces, again, it's things that you're not going to be aware of at first. And so often I have to have others say to me, hey, there was that one moment in the meeting that we had yesterday where this happened, or you said this comment, or someone didn't have a chance to chime in when we really needed their perspective. Like, did you notice that? And sometimes I try to, but there are inevitably those moments when I'm so caught up or feeling passionate about what we're talking about where I don't. And so how do you have those kinds of regular check-ins and the trust between team members to have that kind of feedback? I think that's a big part of it. I mean, we also all need to take accountability for our own learning and development. And so, you know, how are you exposing yourselves through what you watch, through what you read, through what you listen to other ways of knowing and being? We might think that that's separate from the workplace, but especially if you're working with a diverse client base, or, you know, if you're an international, you know, conglomerate working with multiple offices around the world, I mean, this is directly related to you know, what the kind of work that you're doing. So I don't think those can be separated. And a lot of it is through trial and error. So you have to make mistakes to learn from them. That can't be avoided either.
I think there's a couple of really, really important pieces in there. And one of the things for everybody to be aware of, we do it, it's a pretty natural, I think it's a natural human process, is that we negate other people's stories based on our own experience. And we do it really quickly. And in the simplest form, oh, you don't need to think that. And we don't give that space for listening, as you're talking about, John. I think that's brilliant, is that sort of that circle, that loop of listening, but it's intentional listening, and it's not listening for the story that you want to hear. It's not listening for the solution that you're looking for. It's actually listening to what the experience truly is. And the part in there that you talked to a little bit, and you mentioned the feedback and that 360 feedback. And if a team doesn't have a culture of feedback, that's really difficult. And so I think what I really appreciate that you're bringing out here too is that length of time. Like, yes, it's hard work and it takes time. We have to build the trust first of all, and the psychological safety, and that skill set of feedback. And a lot of people, and leaders, individual contributors, we talk a great game when it comes to feedback, but actually delivering it is really hard. And so we're always keen to talk about it, not so keen to do it. And I think that's the first action step that a lot of people could even consider is, am I listening for the feedback that I get? And lots of leaders, like, I love the action that you had. That's a team conversation. But even if you're a leader in a meeting, are you paying attention to the cues and the feedback that you're getting? Because we're always getting it. Everybody's projecting something all the time. And as you said, if you show up ready to pay attention, we can do a lot of learning in that moment as well, and noticing too.
Certainly. Yeah, I would say more listening, less explanation, and also answering or asking probing questions to understand. I think that's a real valuable coaching skill as a leader. I know I've learned from you, Jenny. I mean, when I first heard of coaching, I thought, oh, that's when you give tips and tricks and you explain to someone how to do something. No, no. In fact, it's quite the opposite, isn't it? I mean, it's how do you guide someone along by asking the right questions at the right time to lead them to their own conclusion, right? And so I think that asking those critical questions at the right time and the right way, that's another part of this as well. Also, not easy to do. That's certainly something I'm learning at. So that's another piece of it.
And we'll add on to those questions just while we can to please everybody make sure that they are healthy questions. We can weaponize our curiosity really, really quickly. That's a power piece. And sometimes it happens subconsciously. So our questions want to be like healthy and towards better clarity, not in the favor of us.
There you go.
Sorry, Jenny, in all the time that we've been here together, I've never heard you use that phrase, healthy questions, before. Can you expand on that? It's like, oh, isn't that remarkable kind of moment, right? Can you expand on that a little bit, please? And then, John, I want to come back to, I've got a question.
Sure.
So curiosity, we talk about being curious, and it's a kale of the day. Everybody's throwing that C word around. And there's a really distinct difference between a healthy curiosity and I think, Craig, it's our good friend Tyler that brought it to my attention, weaponized curiosity. Yeah. And so when we're asking a healthy question, we will address, if you like, we'll address the elephant. So it includes, it's got the clarity in it. This is what the question is about. But the question aims to elevate the other person. You put them in a place where it's safe and healthy for them to answer that question from their perspective, and it engages them in the conversation too. So a classic weaponized or dirty question might be, Craig, why did you do it that way? And that why I'm putting you on the back foot, I'm suggesting that you've done it wrong. There's just a blame throw in there. Whereas if I lean in with, you know, Craig, I've never heard that version of this experience. Can you expand on that for me, please? And
Okay.
then I had the key with that when you ask a question, and we're dreadful at this too. When you ask a question, stop talking.
Okay.
There you go.
Good.
That's a short
Thank
version.
you. I'm actually going to jump to questions in the chat versus mine. So I agree that as leaders, we need to be paying attention to the cues our teams are giving us with feedback, or as somebody called us out in the chat, Jenny, feed forward, as you like to call it.
I do.
There you go.
Yes. However, the leader is also spending a lot of time being the one who is leading the discussion. As a leader, are there ways to do both effectively?
Ooh, I like that one. I would say yes, but Jenny, do you want to take that first? Or
So if I understand correctly, the leaders facilitating, it's hard to facilitate and watch. Is that what the question?
I believe so, yeah, right?
Yeah, okay.
As a facilitator leading the conversation, how are you like to effectively watch the cues and the feed forward?
Okay.
Right?
A couple of things. It does depend on the size of your team, and it does depend on the conversation, and it does depend if you're doing this. If you're on Zoom, is much harder. The minute that you're on Zoom or Teams, and you have cameras on, if you have cameras off, game over. I'm actually going to ask if anybody's listening on the other end. But if you have cameras on, can you use somebody else to help you watch the body language? So when we're doing a delivery online, we have a moderator. I will often ask the moderator to pay attention to the body language on the cameras because I can't see them all. In an actual meeting, face to face, the first thing I'm going to say is, as a leader, how much talking are you doing? And we talk about this a lot, the voice share. And John, you mentioned it. How am I making space for people to give their perspective, give their thought, who's getting interrupted, etc. So as a leader, first off, how much talking are you doing? And if you're not talking, then you're able to pay attention. I think if you're talking in a room, you're still picking up information. And maybe it's just switching the mindset towards, you know what you're talking about and how are your team taking that. Wish that made sense. See, John, see if you can tidy it up a bit for me.
No. Yeah, no, that's one of my tips, Jenny. Have a moderator in the room, especially for large groups, town halls, if you're doing, you know, a keynote or delivering to a large cohort of learners. Agreed, totally. I think there's a few other things to consider. So one is to make sure you have a set agenda so that you make sure you're following through in a structured way about all the things you need to address. And so should conversations start going sideways in ways you didn't imagine, you've got something to come back to keep you on track. I would also say, though, there's a shared accountability component here. So, for example, when possible, the approach we take in our team, we actually share the responsibility of hosting meetings. So for our team meeting once a week, for example, we've got a rotating schedule where everybody has their chance multiple times a year to do that, again, following that set structure. But of course, they can add their own personal flair and flavor to it. So again, it doesn't always have to be me hosting everything, just given my, you know, rank in the hierarchy. I think good practice is to minimize hierarchy where we can, where appropriate. That's all part of it too. So taking that shared hosting accountability, I mean, saves me time and energy. It gives me the chance to hear and really focus on others. And it also gives others, and for some people, that's a stretch learning opportunity because they've never hosted before. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that action step. And I'm going to add on to it too. If you're a leader and you're listening, you're like, oh, that's a good idea. It does mean too that you can give the responsibility for the agenda over too, and let whoever's hosting own the meeting. If you have something you need on the agenda, well, great, ask them to put it on the agenda. But it really, it's an expansion and flattening the hierarchy from time to time, especially as we move to this crucial need for collaboration. It's a great start and a great practice for any team. Yeah, it's cool.
Cool. Thank you both. There's been lots of great conversation in the chat, and I just scrolled back and caught a question that I missed earlier that I think is really important to get in here around the call in, call out conversation. And that there's a couple of questions tied together here is, what if the leader displays the bad behavior? And how do you build a team environment where team members are comfortable calling in or calling out their leaders?
Yeah, when the power is there, it makes it difficult. By power, I mean, you know, you have the ability to influence or control someone's behavior, the outcome of a situation, the way that resources and money is distributed. That's what I mean by power. I don't know, Jenny, if you want to add to what we mean by power, but I
No,
think that's what it's about. Yeah.
I agree. Leadership is a power. Yeah.
So, I mean, what to do about that? Well, I mean, I think maybe I'll put more questions on the table because this will help. So let's say, you know, Craig, you're my leader and we have an interaction that doesn't go well. I think I would ask myself 3 questions about, you know, how do I want to understand why I'm feeling the way I am and what do I want to do about it? So the first thing I would ask myself is, you know, Craig, what were your intentions in that moment? You know,
Mhm.
was it coming from a place of hate or was it coming from a place of, you know, just awkward misunderstanding? Are you trying to learn, but you're not there yet? So I'd want to consider what I think your intentions were, regardless of how I felt about the impact. So that's one thing that might determine how you react. Another is what's best for me. I mean, if the situation is such that we don't have, and I don't feel safe in the workplace, and we've had a history of bad interactions in the past, it's probably not a good idea for me to be more proactive and call you out. But if we do have a history that we have a relationship and we've been working on it for a while, I might feel more comfortable to say, you know what, I'm going to approach you and I'm going to give you this comment or feedback. The last thing for me as an individual, what I want to get out of it. So, do I just want you to remember for next time, or do I think that it's necessary, given our history, that you should be held to account at a higher level? So, I would start by asking myself those questions because, in the end, I mean, you know, I need to make sure that I am safe, that I can continue my career and do what I want to do, and that if in the end I do the pros and cons and it's not worth it for me to say anything or to go take it as far as I want, that's something I have to deal with. I mean, it depends. I mean, you can start by calling in if you have that relationship. If it's an extreme example, then you know what? That's why we have confidential third party harassment and
Yeah.
discrimination hotlines, right? If I don't feel comfortable, you know, confronting you in a direct way, that's what those services are for. Sometimes you got to go there. I mean, do you have a trusted guide, advisor, confidant that you can speak with before coming to someone like you if
Mm.
you were my leader? Sometimes it's helpful to role play or to just bounce ideas off as you prepare. But Jenny, please, I mean, how do you if you're my leader and you've got a problem, how do I address that?
I think John, you covered it, and two things that I really want to sort of ask people to explore a lot. You know, when I think of this conversation, my greatest mentor period is our 16-year-old daughter, and our other children too, but Sophie really leads the charge on this one. And you know, Mum, you can't say that anymore. Mum, I can't believe that this adult said this. And
Yeah.
initially I remember sort of sitting there with an interested voice but not digging into that, whereas nowadays when she comes up with something, so if you've got to tell me more, you've got to explain this to me. And I think when it comes to, you know, we talk a lot about managing up and managing down. End of the day, we're all humans. Now what I really appreciated that you said, John, is when this is extreme discrimination, harassment, bullying, there's a process, there are pieces in place to help us with that, and that's essential. When
Mm,
this is more everyday conversations, if you have the relationship, the skill set for managing up is the same skill set for managing down. The difference is the power, as you recognized in that. But if the trust and the psychological safety are there, once you've asked those 3 questions, you're in a place. And what I really encourage leaders to think about is if somebody comes and they're calling you in, that is such a compliment to you as a leader because they
Yeah.
feel safe to have that conversation. If they are, it might feel like a challenge. Our egos are a little bit hairy and a little bit scary. And what a wonderful compliment that is. So thank them and lean in a little. Lean into that call in. There's a lot of ins in there. And really explore that because I think that learning piece, that's where it happens.
mm.
That's good. Thank you both for that. I'm looking at our time, and I know we've got some fairly meaty, big idea strategies and questions. Speaking of questions, I know there's a few we have not gotten to. We will figure out how to get to them in the follow-up or figure out how to have John back very soon to carry on this conversation. But I think this has been great. And I know I have learned a ton this morning, but I think it's time to move on to the big idea, applied strategies, and 3 questions. And that was Craig stretching the time for Jenny to get the slides.
1 more minute, stretch it just a little bit further.
Stretch a little bit further, I can try.
Okay, I think we're on the right one. If we get the wrong slide next, John, I'll find it. You go for it. I'll try and keep up with you.
Okay. Yeah, no, you got it here. Okay, so big idea, kind of the underpinning. Oh, there we go. Yeah. The underpinning of, EDI work in general, but this is also a big part of critical theory and the humanities and social sciences and beyond. Really trying to think about the different pieces of your identity and how they interplay in your lived experience from day to day. I think that critical reflection piece is really an important part of the learning and the unlearning. So taking the time to consider this in large and small ways is something to think about, especially as a leader, given the power, privilege, and influence that you have. So that's big idea. If we go to the next one, this was around, yes, so calling in and calling out. So mistakes happen. There will be misunderstandings and conflict, large and small, in the workplace. And so if someone offends you, what might you do about that? Again, you can decide to do nothing, should that be what you think is best. Usually it's best to try and address it, either by calling in or calling out. Calling in is a more relationship building, calm process that happens one-on-one after the fact. And you want to really understand a person's intentions and make them understand that the impact might be different than what they initially planned. The calling out piece, on the other hand, that's a more direct process that usually happens in the moment, where you need to really acknowledge the behavior and make sure that it doesn't happen again. That could happen in a public way. But the person needs to understand that that behavior is violating codes of conduct, it's not helpful or respectful, and it cannot happen again. So that's calling in or calling out. 2 applied strategies. You decide what's best based on a few things. What do you want to get out of it? How safe do you feel? Have you had this conversation in the past with your leader? And what are the power dynamics in the room or in the meeting? So a few things to think about in terms of what's best for you and where do you want to go with it. So 2 applied strategies there. And then these questions, again, 3 questions to leave with. This is for someone to think about before acting, or again, to discuss with a trusted advisor, mentor, and so on. So what were their intentions in the moment? What's best for you? And I think most importantly, what do you want to get out of this going forward? So those are 3 crucial things to ask yourself if and when conflict arises.
Brilliant.
Perfect. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Our second last episode before the summer break. And Jenny, we'll be back in 2 weeks with Evan Westlake to talk about critical thinking for leaders. And I've thrown a link in the notes for folks on how to register for that. With that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. John, thank you again for making your time available this morning and your insights. Very, really valuable. Great stuff. Thank you.
Yeah,
No,
thank you, John. Thank you, Craig.
And with that, have a great couple of weeks, and we'll see you again before we all get to Stampede. So take care, everybody.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye for now.